Hi, class. Well, we have reached the final part of our textbook, part five, which is about terminating employment. We spent a lot of time talking about, the relationship, with work and everything, but this is kind of the last of the employee life cycle, from hiring to firing, if you will. So here we are at the terminating employment for chapter 16 and 17. And for 16 here, we're talking about terminating individual employees. So, generally, unless you have a contract, unless you actually have an individual employment contract that you have signed, and very few of us do, you are considered employment at will, which means your employer can fire you for almost any reason, and you can quit your job for almost any reason. So it's a two-way street, essentially. So where, if an employer isn't happy with your job performance, or you say some mean things to your boss, whatever, they can fire you. Whereas you have the same token, if you're not happy at work and you feel like there's better jobs out there, or you're just not getting along with your boss, of course you can quit. So absent an actual employment contract or absent a union agreement, and we kind of talked about that last chapter, you can quit for any reason, or you can be fired for almost any reason. That's under employment at will. Now, when I say you can be fired for any reason, as long as it's a legal reason, obviously somebody can't fire you for being because of your age, or they can't fire you because of your sex or your race or your religion, national origin. Obviously, all that is completely illegal. But if they're just not happy with the way things are going, they can let you go. So there is one exception to that, though. This idea of what we call constructive discharge, where you can basically, let's just say you're in a work environment where it's very hostile and your boss is just incredibly mean, and there could be potential things like racial harassment or sexual harassment going on. Constructive discharge means that you basically had no choice but to get out of there, given how horrible the environment is. And there's a small section in your book that discusses constructive discharge, so make sure you read up on that. So I do want to pay particular close attention to page 641 and table 16.1 about wrongful discharge. That chart does do a pretty good job of explaining when a discharge could be viewed as wrongful. So, because in theory, you could come into work and your boss says, "I don't like your tie, it doesn't match our decor, you're fired." And that's probably going to be held to be legal. It's not a good reason to fire somebody, but it's not an illegal reason either. So, but Table 16.1 does a good job of discussing what wrongful discharge is and what some elements of that look like. So make sure you pay attention to that chart. Your book does kind of do a pretty good section on what we call implied contract as regards to terminating employees. We're not going to discuss that, and that won't be a test question, only because implied contracts are a real kind of tricky legal concept. And we could literally spend probably 2 class periods just on implied contracts when it comes to employment. So again, we're going to skip that part. Won't even worry about it on the exam. But there is one important thing that I do want to discuss. It's kind of about on page 651 about public policy exceptions to termination. Because there are times when it benefits society, if you will, that you shouldn't be fired for something. So this whole idea of a public policy exception. And I think page 651 gives you 4 or 5 different examples. And to me, the most obvious one is unless your boss says, "Hey, I'm trying to embezzle money, and if you don't help me embezzle, I'm going to fire you." So, or hey, it's part of your job today, I want you to go rob that bank. Obviously you're refusing to break the law and then they fire you is not a good reason for an employer to say, "Well, I fired him because they didn't do what I said." Well, if what you said to do involves breaking the law, obviously you don't want to do that. So that would be an example of a public policy exception to the rules. So make sure you understand what public policy exceptions are in discharge. And I'm sure at some point in our lives we've either seen a TV show or read a book or seen something about whistleblowers. The WPA, the Whistleblower Protection Act, basically prevents companies from severely going after employees who maybe blow the whistle, so to speak, on widespread corruption or widespread environments. And I think probably the most obvious one you've probably heard about are like Big Tobacco, where employees came forward and exposed these big tobacco companies for the health harms of nicotine. So that's probably the most well-known example when it comes to whistleblower protection. So make sure you kind of have a general understanding of what the WPA is and what it protects. So I think for me in this chapter, again, there's a lot of really important stuff, but I think this whole idea of due process, and a lot of what I do in my job, unfortunately in my job, there are times where I do have to terminate employees, and in most of the HR jobs that I've had in my career, at some point I've had to fire employees. It's never fun. It's oftentimes necessary, but it's never fun. But every employee that I've ever worked with that we eventually had to terminate for whatever reason was owed due process. The idea of being not just a random road manager saying, I don't like you, what you're wearing, you're fired, get out of here. Everybody has the right to be able to, explain themselves, show any evidence as to why they shouldn't be fired. Things along those lines. It's just like in a court of law where, criminal defendants get due process of law. It's no different, in the terminating of relationship aspects. And, like for a prime example, we'll use a university professors, if a bunch of students, submit those course evaluations, say, oh, this professor was terrible, I didn't learn anything, the class was awful, I want this professor fired. The department chair can't read this and think, oh, okay, you know what, they make a good point, he's a bad professor, we're just going to fire him. That professor is owed due process, the ability to share, why they shouldn't be fired. There's a process. They may have to go before a hearing panel, and they have a right to provide a written statement. So all these things have to happen before a termination can occur. And then a lot of cases that get to the court levels, a lot of times when an employee was terminated and they get brought back or get reinstated, for example, a lot of times the reason is the company did not provide that employee due process, the ability to share, why they shouldn't have been fired. I think that one of the last points of the chapter is about PIPs, performance improvement plans. A lot of companies, if an employee is showing that they're not performing up to standard, a company will create this performance improvement plan to try to help them get back on track. Shows them what they need to do to improve. And most companies use PIPs for two reasons. One, for due process, to show that they're trying to work with the employee, trying to help them get back on track. But also, it's also legal protection for the company to show, hey, look, we tried. We've been working with this employee. We want them to do better. But if they continue to decline, it's showing that we didn't just voluntarily or randomly fire them. We have justifiable reasons for letting that employee go. So again, you'll see performance improvement plans used in a lot of varieties, but that's definitely one aspect of it. And finally, for this chapter, I want you to know, I think it's on page 677, about First Amendment speech rights. There's a lot of, cases and a lot of case law out there about, what you can and can't say at work that could get you fired. Obviously, if you use a bunch of 4-letter curse words and, screaming, the F words and the S words and all those at your boss, that's probably not protected First Amendment speech for obvious reasons, because you're attacking, or if you're making threatening, like I'm going to kill you or I'm going to punch you, that's probably not First Amendment protected, because again, you're making direct threats. Whereas if you, an employee, are sitting in the break room and you're talking about a controversial topic, let's say you're talking about abortion, or you're talking about any other controversial topic, and you're both you're calmly having a disagreement. A company can't say, well, it is our opinion that you're right, you're wrong, so we're going to fire you. That's probably not going to be held to be a valid termination, because again, you're discussing First Amendment free speech information. And again, excuse me, I remember when I was in law school, I took a whole semester class which was just on the First Amendment, and we spent a lot of time in that class talking about what is free speech and what is not free speech, especially especially when you're at work. So I won't bore you with those details because there's a lot to it, but just know that generally you have First Amendment's free speech rights at work, and your employer can't fire you unless it is usually a direct threat, or you're harassing or things along those lines. So that's generally protected. A lot of information about from chapter 16, but a lot of good information to kind of help us understand about what it means to terminate individual employees. So we'll just have one chapter left, chapter 17. So we'll see you all that very soon.